Now this is Dirty Down Snot and this is Dirty Down Gore. Two new products from the Dirty Down range. But are they actually any good? What sort of effects can you get, and what also are the limitations? Well, today we're going to test these out through a range of different tests to see what they can and can't do, and hopefully let you see if they're right for you and your project. Now first of all, thank you to Goblin's Hut for sending me both the Dirty Down Gore and the Dirty Down Snot to test out. Okay, so let's start with Dirty Down Snot. Now when you first look at it, it's kind of as you'd expect. It is very gloopy, very viscous, but this stuff is also crystal clear. Now I believe you can tint it or paint it, but we'll test that properly later on. Now with all these things, especially with something new, it's worth checking out the precautions and the safety instructions to make sure you're not going to miss something. Now this stuff is labelled as very flammable, both the goo and especially the vapour that comes off it. So vapour is one thing to be aware of. Also it says to make sure you use it either outside or in a well ventilated area. So even though this stuff has no particular smell when you open the jar, probably best not risk it. Let's go. So to really test this stuff and to see what it can actually do and what it can't, I'm not going to use a model. Instead, I'm going to use some old sprue. Now the reason being is that I can cut out most of the gates and create comparable spaces to test this over. And to make it even more comparable, I've primed it in grey Tamiya surface primer and then gone over that with some sand yellow by Vallejo, just with the airbrush to give it a coat of paint. Because I'm interested to see how well this stuff adheres to paint, but also will it risk lifting off any paint. Now this stuff, it says not to stir it up or shake it, so I'm going to use a cocktail stick and simply put a small dab of that on and just try and stretch it across the smaller gaps. Now this is a very viscous liquid, and if you use the cocktail stick you can get a small amount in the end and just dab it to one side and kind of hook it onto any protuberances that are there or even onto the flat plastic, and then just kind of stretch it across the gap. Then touch down the other side to secure it. Now one thing I wanted to try out was, I've used a straight cocktail stick, but what if you use a wider implement? So for example, this is a lollipop stick, and I've just kind of bent it so into 90 degrees and then dunked that in the Dirty Down Snot. So I've got quite a wide area which I'm stretching it from start from. But interestingly, if you do this, it starts off wide and as it goes stretches out, it then narrows down into a much narrower point at the other end, which is quite a nice interesting effect. Okay, so we've tested it out across smaller gaps and it works quite well like that. Okay, so let's try and push it a bit further and see if we can stretch it across much bigger gaps and see how it behaves then. Okay, so you can do that. It will tend to sag a little bit in the middle, but especially if you put another string going across it, it kind of supports it quite nicely. Next, I decided to try and push my luck a little bit, and basically I tried to create a spider web out of it. Now what this shows is quite interesting how it kind of links up and how it attaches to itself and supports itself. But also what I noticed, it's quite easy to direct exactly where you want it to go. If there's a bit that snaps or kind of goes loose, then you can either just knock it off, snap it off, or you can just simply cut it away very, very easily. But also whilst doing that, if you do flick something off a painted surface, it's not taking paint with it, which is good to know. Now looking at the spider web, it kind of reminded me, because I remember one time I was over in Belize, I was walking down a jungle track and I saw this massive spider web, and it was almost kind of lime green. It looked like fishing wire. So one, if you know what that spider was that was meant to be in that spider web, then let me know down in the comments, because I have no idea. But secondly, I wonder if you can mix in some ink to tint the clear fluid to create that kind of green spider web, for example. So I'm using some of this ink in this because it's quite pigment dense, but it's still very liquidy and runny. Now, interestingly, the more I mix it, the more viscous it's becoming. It's trying to, I don't know if it's the mixing or if it is the ink reacting with it, but it's kind of going off much faster than it does normally. Now, one thing I did notice with this is that when you are working with it, you've got quite a decent amount of working time before it dries. So you can move it around or play with it to get it to what you want it to be before it goes hard. But if I mix some of this ink into it, it goes off a lot quicker. Also, because it's going off quicker, it's not going across the gap. It's not stretching across the gap nowhere near as effectively as it did before. Okay, so that's interesting, but whilst that dries off completely, let's have a play with the Dirty Down Gore. Now, having a look at it, and even just as you get the first little bit out with the cocktail stick, it's slightly more fluid than the Dirty Down Snot. It's not quite as gooey, but that means that it does kind of stretch across the gaps slightly easier than the other stuff did. Now, I was under the impression that the Dirty Down Gore was basically the Dirty Down Snot, but with the colouring, with the paint already in it, which is beneficial because you're going to get the same colour, the same red tone every time you use it. So it does cut down on that variation. It also means that you're more confident that you're going to get the results that you're expecting. But it does appear to behave slightly differently. Now, if you look at this, because the Dirty Down Gore is slightly runnier, it does kind of it does stretch very nicely across the gap. It tends to flow, but it does pool and collects like gore. It gives quite a nice effect. And once you've stretched it all out and placed it, it does just look nasty. Very effective, but gross. But I guess that's kind of what you want, isn't it? Also, what is quite interesting, whilst it does stretch across a gap very nicely, the Dirty Down Gore does appear to be slightly more random than the Dirty Down Snot. So if I try and recreate that spiderweb, even on a slightly smaller scale, it tends to kind of attach and draw itself together much more than it did with the Dirty Down Snot. So you can't lay out individual strands quite so easily. So it's not quite as regular, it's not quite as predictable as the Dirty Down Snot for some reason. I don't know why, but that is the result I've got today. Now, even though I said at the start when you first open it there's not much of a smell, when you've been working with it for a little while, I was very glad of the respirator. It's like a really strong kind of enamel paint kind of smell. So yeah, if you're doing it inside, you're definitely going to want lots of ventilation and a mask. Or you could do it outside. Okay, so looking at these two products, both of them really, really interesting. So the Dirty Down Snot is really nice for giving you kind of those mucusy, snotty strings. But also, my brain is now kicking off with all sorts of ideas of different ways I could potentially use this. Maybe in a completely different way to what was initially intended. I need to experiment with that a bit more, but I will come back to you on that one. The Dirty Down Gore does what it says in the tin. It's more than just a technical paint. Even just painting it onto a flat surface will give you that bloody gory look. But stretching it out, it gives a beautiful and gruesome effect. Now, at time of filming, it is just being released in the US and it's being rolled out across the rest of the world. Now, if either of these two products look right for you and your project, then I'll put some links down in the description. So therefore you can go and check out the most up-to-date prices and also get hold of some for yourself. So as things get rolled out across the world, I'll then put links down in the description there for you as well. Now, I hope you enjoyed that and found that useful. Now, if you looking at that, if you did think of any ideas of different ways you could use this stuff, then let me know down in the comments. And I may well use those and test those out and include those in a follow-up video. And whilst I test that out, you might want to check out this video here. It is a good one. I think I like that one. And I'll see you there.